"Will you stay with me tonight?" the lonely Apache asked the innocent maid when their eyes met. The sun was slowly setting behind the distant hills, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. The village, small and quiet, seemed to hold its breath as the day came to an end. Smoke rose gently from a few chimneys, and the sound of a dog barking in the distance echoed faintly through the streets. It was a peaceful evening, one that invited calm and reflection. Children were finishing their play, running across the dusty paths before heading home. Women were calling out to each other, carrying buckets of water or preparing the evening meal. The air smelled of fresh bread, warm earth, and the faint scent of wild flowers that grew near the edge of the village. On the far side of the village, a figure appeared, moving slowly along the road that led into town. He was tall, lean, and carried himself with careful caution, as if every step required attention. His clothes were worn and his boots were dusty from long travel, but there was a dignity in the way he walked. His dark hair fell over his forehead, slightly messy from the wind, and his eyes, deep and thoughtful, scanned the village as he approached. This was an Apache, a traveler from the lands beyond the hills. He carried with him not weapons or anger, but a quiet sadness and a loneliness that seemed to follow him like a shadow. The villagers noticed him almost immediately. Some stopped what they were doing and whispered to one another. Outsiders were rare here, and travelers from distant tribes often brought stories that were both exciting and frightening. Mothers pulled their children closer while men exchanged wary glances. The Apache's presence stirred a mixture of curiosity and fear, a combination that had always existed in the hearts of those who lived near the borderlands. In the middle of the village, a young maid was finishing her chores. She was gentle in her movements, carrying water to a small garden where vegetables grew in neat rows. Her hair was tied back with a simple ribbon, and her dress, though plain, was clean and tidy. She noticed the stranger almost at the same moment the village did. Their eyes met across the dusty square, and in that instant, time seemed to slow. There was no hostility in his gaze, only a quiet question, a longing for connection that mirrored a feeling she did not yet fully understand. For a moment, she hesitated. She had been taught to be cautious with strangers, especially those who came from faraway lands. Her parents had always warned her about the dangers that could lurk behind kind eyes. But there was something different about him. He carried himself with care, spoke softly when he asked a passerby for directions, and seemed respectful of the space around him. His presence was unusual, not threatening, and it stirred a sense of curiosity within her that she could not ignore. The Apache stopped at the edge of the village square, taking a careful look around. He seemed to consider whether it was safe to enter fully, whether someone would offer him shelter for the night. Finally, with a deep breath and a careful glance toward the maid, he walked closer. His steps were deliberate but not heavy, showing that he meant no harm. When he reached a few feet away, he spoke in a quiet, clear voice. "Will you stay with me tonight?" he asked, his words carrying a mixture of hope and hesitancy. He did not demand, nor did he expect an immediate answer. It was a question born of loneliness, a simple wish for kindness in a world that had not always been gentle to him. The maid blinked, caught off guard. The question was unusual, unexpected, but there was a sincerity in it that made her pause. She could feel the eyes of the villagers on her, some curious, some wary, and some clearly concerned. Yet in her heart, she felt a pull toward this quiet stranger, a feeling that helping him would not only be right but also important. She took a step closer and spoke softly. "You can rest for the night. Our village is small, but we can offer a warm fire and a place to sleep." Her voice carried a mixture of caution and warmth, careful not to alarm anyone but honest in her intention. The Apache's face softened, and a small smile appeared, almost shyly. He nodded, expressing gratitude without words, and followed her toward the small house where she lived with her family. Along the way, the villagers continued to watch, some whispering, some shaking their heads, and some simply observing silently. The tension in the air was still present, but there was a subtle shift. The stranger was no longer a threat in their eyes, simply a visitor, someone to be met with care and attention. As they walked, The maid noticed small details about him. His hands were calloused, showing the work of someone accustomed to life outdoors. His eyes, dark and deep, held memories of places she could only imagine. She wondered about his journey, the roads he had traveled, the rivers he had crossed, and the mountains he had climbed. There was a quiet strength in him, a resilience that was evident in every careful step he took. When they reached her home, her family greeted him cautiously. Her parents were polite but reserved, offering a simple meal of bread, soup, and water. The Apache accepted without hesitation, showing gratitude in quiet ways. A nod, a small smile, a gentle thank you spoken in a voice that carried the weight of his experiences. He did not boast, did not ask for more than what was offered. He simply accepted the kindness extended to him, and in doing so, he earned a measure of trust. After the meal, the maid led him to a small room where he could rest. The bad man, it was modest, with a bed covered in a clean blanket and a small window that looked out onto the hills beyond. He looked around carefully, as if to ensure that the space was safe, then nodded in appreciation. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It has been a long journey and kindness is rare." The maid smiled gently, feeling a warmth in her chest she could not explain. Sometimes kindness is all we have to share, and it can make a long journey easier. They both fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that comes from mutual respect and unspoken understanding. Outside, the village continued its evening routines, but inside that small room, a fragile trust had been established. For the Apache, it was a relief to find shelter and acceptance. For the maid, it was a moment of courage and compassion, a chance to see beyond fear and suspicion. As the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows stretched across the floor, and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky. The Apache looked out the window, taking in the vastness of the land he had traveled, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. The maid sat nearby, quietly attending to small tasks, but occasionally stealing glances at the traveler who had entered her life so unexpectedly. Neither of them spoke much that evening, but words were not necessary. In their shared silence, there was understanding, a connection that went beyond language or custom. The world outside the village remained uncertain and often dangerous, but in that small house, two strangers found a moment of safety and a spark of human connection. As night fully fell and the village lights flickered softly, the maid prepared to rest as well. She felt a quiet anticipation for the days ahead, knowing that the presence of the Apache would bring new stories, new lessons, and new experiences. The stranger in turn felt a fragile hope that perhaps not all people were unkind, that there could be moments of trust and friendship even in a world full of challenges. And so, the night began, gentle and calm, carrying with it the promise of connection, understanding, and the small yet powerful act of offering shelter to someone in need. For both the maid and the Apache, this evening would be remembered not just for the kindness shared, but for the moment when their eyes first met and an unexpected friendship began. The morning sun rose slowly over the village, spreading warm light across the rooftops and streets. Birds chirped cheerfully from the trees, and the scent of dew-covered grass mixed with the aroma of fresh bread being baked by the villagers. It was a new day, one that promised both work and quiet moments of peace. In the small house where the maid lived, she was already awake, moving quietly so as not to disturb the Apache who had stayed the night. The Apache was awake as well. He sat by the window, looking out at the village bathed in soft morning light. His eyes were thoughtful, reflecting on the kindness he had received the previous evening. For someone who had traveled alone for many days, shelter and a warm meal were treasures more valuable than gold. He took a deep breath, feeling a small sense of belonging, even if only for a short time. The maid quietly prepared breakfast, placing warm bread, fresh fruit, and a small pot of porridge on the table. She called softly to him, "Breakfast is ready. You can come eat whenever you like." Her voice was gentle, carrying a hint of curiosity about the man who had appeared in her life so suddenly. He approached the table with careful steps, bowing his head slightly in gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly. His voice was soft but steady, carrying the weight of his travels and experiences. As he ate, he noticed the simplicity and care in the meal. Everything was clean, fresh, and made with thoughtfulness. It reminded him of the small joys he often missed while traveling alone. After breakfast, the maid suggested he rest for a while, but the Apache insisted on helping with small chores around the house. He swept the floor with quiet attention, moved firewood into neat piles, and even helped carry water from the well. Each action showed respect for the home and the family, earning quiet admiration from the maid. She noticed how careful he was, not just in his work, but in how he treated her and the home. Outside, villagers were beginning their day. Some paused to watch the stranger from a distance. There was still a hint of worry in their eyes, but curiosity seemed stronger now. They noticed how the Apache moved, how he carried himself with care, and how the maid interacted with him. Slowly, they began to sense that he was not a threat, but someone who valued kindness as much as they did. The maid decided to take a walk with him through the village. She wanted to show him where to find the well, the bakery, and other important places, but also to observe how the villagers would react. As they walked side by side, she explained small details about the village, its people, and its daily routines. The Apache listened carefully, asking polite questions and showing genuine interest in her words. "I have never seen a village like this," he said softly. "It is quiet, but it feels alive. People here care for one another even in small ways. Yes, our village may be small, but we try to help one another. It is not always easy, but kindness matters." As they continued, they passed a group of children playing near the edge of the square. The Apache paused for a moment, watching them with a gentle expression. He seemed both fascinated and slightly nostalgic, as if the sight reminded him of a simpler time. One of the children ran up to him, holding a small wooden toy. "Do you want to play?" the child asked, eyes wide with curiosity. The Apache smiled faintly and nodded. "Yes, thank you." His hands were careful as he took the toy, and soon he was gently tossing it back to the child. Laughter filled the air, and the maid could not help but feel joy at seeing the stranger so warmly received, even in such a small way. Later, they returned to her home, and the maid invited him to sit for a while. She wanted to talk, to learn more about the man who had entered her life, but also to share her own thoughts and dreams. They sat quietly at first, watching the soft movement of the sun across the room. Then slowly, conversation began. He spoke of his travels, the long journeys through hills and forests, and the nights spent under stars that seemed endless. He shared stories of the people he had met, the challenges he had faced, and the lessons he had learned. There was no boastfulness in his words, only honesty and reflection. Each story seemed to carry a quiet wisdom, and the maid listened intently, asking questions and expressing her wonder. In turn, the maid spoke of her life in the village, the small routines, the joys of helping her family, and her dreams of seeing the world beyond the hills. She told him about her friends, the festivals, and the simple pleasures of life that often went unnoticed by those who traveled far. The Apache listened, his expression softening with each word. He seemed fascinated by the simplicity and beauty of her world, a contrast to his own long and sometimes lonely journey. As the afternoon passed, they moved outside to the small garden where the maid often worked. The Apache knelt beside her, learning how to plant seeds, how to water carefully, and how to care for each plant. He asked questions, listened to her instructions, and even offered suggestions based on his own experiences. Together they worked quietly, the rhythm of their movements creating a sense of harmony. At one point, a small argument arose nearby. Two villagers disagreed about a minor task, raising their voices slightly. The Apache noticed the tension and suggested calmly, "Sometimes patience can solve more than force. Listening can bring peace." The maid smiled quietly at his words. They were simple, yet carried a wisdom that resonated even in a small village. As the day continued, the bond between the maid and the Apache grew stronger. They shared small laughs over simple mistakes in the garden, helped each other with chores, and discovered that they could communicate without words as easily as with them. A sense of trust was forming, fragile but steady, built on respect, kindness, and the understanding that neither intended harm. As evening approached, a gentle breeze stirred the trees, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the faint sounds of villagers returning home. The Apache helped prepare a small dinner, moving with care and showing gratitude for the food offered. They ate together quietly, enjoying the comfort of warmth and company. The maid noticed how his presence seemed to calm her own thoughts, and she felt a sense of companionship she had never experienced before. After dinner, they sat outside for a while, watching the sky change from golden to deep blue. Stars began to twinkle, and the first sounds of night creatures filled the air. The maid asked him about the stars, curious about the ways of travelers who often use them to navigate. The Apache smiled and pointed out constellations, explaining their names and stories in simple language. She listened, fascinated by the knowledge he carried, and felt a sense of wonder at how vast the world beyond the village must be. As night fell completely, the maid led him back to the small room where he was staying. There was a quiet understanding between them now, an unspoken agreement that this brief time together was important, meaningful, and safe. The Apache sat quietly for a moment, looking out the window at the village lights, then turned to the maid. "Thank you for today," he said softly. "It has been long since I have felt welcome, since I have felt seen." The maid smiled gently, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "Sometimes seeing someone for who they truly are is all it takes, and you are kind and gentle. That is enough." They both prepared for sleep, but neither rushed the moment. Outside, the night was calm, the village bathed in silver moonlight. Inside, two strangers had begun to form a bond, fragile yet real, built on trust, respect, and the quiet joy of shared moments. The world beyond the village remained uncertain, but here, in this small house, understanding and kindness had created a haven. Before closing her eyes, the maid thought about the day they had spent together. It was full of small lessons, laughter, and discoveries, and it had shown her that trust could be given carefully, even to someone unknown. The Apache, too, reflected on the day, feeling a sense of hope that perhaps his travels could include moments of peace and connection, moments where he could be both safe and understood. And so, the night deepened, carrying with it the gentle promise of tomorrow. A promise that trust, friendship, and understanding could grow even between strangers from different worlds, and that a single act of kindness could change the course of someone's journey forever. Morning arrived softly, as if the world itself did not want to disturb the calm that had grown between the maid and the traveler. The sunlight slipped through the small window and rested gently on the wooden floor. Outside, birds sang their morning songs, and the village slowly came back to life. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the distant sound of footsteps echoed on dusty paths. The maid woke early and stepped outside to breathe in the cool air. She felt peaceful, but also thoughtful. The last 2 days had been unlike anything she had experienced before. A stranger had entered her quiet life, yet instead of fear she felt understanding. Instead of worry, she felt comfort. She did not know where this connection would lead, but she knew it mattered.
Inside the house, the Apache traveler was awake as well.
He sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on his knees, thinking about the kindness he had received. He had spent many nights alone under open skies, guided only by stars and instinct. But these last nights had been different. He had slept under a roof, surrounded by warmth, and welcomed without judgment. It made him feel something he had not felt in a long time: hope. When he stepped outside, he saw the maid watering the small garden. Dew still clung to the leaves, and the flowers bent slightly under its weight. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "Good morning," she said softly. "Good morning," he replied, returning the smile. They stood quietly for a moment, enjoying the simple peace of the morning. Then she handed him a small bucket. "Would you like to help? The plants need water before the sun gets too strong." He nodded and joined her, pouring water gently onto the soil. They worked side by side, their movements slow and calm. There was no need for many words. Their silence felt easy, not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people feel safe with each other. After they finished, they sat on the wooden steps outside the house. The village was waking fully now. Children ran past them, laughing. A cart rolled by, pulled by a tired but steady horse. Somewhere nearby, someone was singing softly while working. The maid looked at him and said, "You seem lighter today." He tilted his head slightly. "Lighter. Yes," she said. "Like something heavy is not pressing on you anymore." He thought for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe you are right. It feels easier to breathe here." She smiled at his words, though she was not sure why they touched her so deeply. Later that morning, she invited him to walk beyond the village, toward the open fields and hills nearby. "The land is beautiful this time of year," she said. "You should see it." He agreed, and soon they were walking along a narrow path that led past fields of tall grass and wildflowers. The sky was wide and clear, and the wind carried the scent of earth and sunlight. Birds flew overhead, and the land seemed endless. As they walked, the maid asked, "Do you ever get tired of traveling alone?" He paused before answering. "Sometimes. The world is big, and when you walk it alone, it can feel even bigger. But traveling also teaches you many things."
"Like what?" she asked.
He smiled slightly. "How to listen. How to wait. How to trust your own strength." She nodded thoughtfully. "I have lived here my whole life. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to see more, to know more. There is beauty in staying too," he said gently. "Roots can be just as strong as wings."
She laughed softly.
That is a nice way to say it. They continued walking until they reached a small stream that flowed quietly between smooth stones. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and the sound of it was calming. The maid sat on a rock near the edge, dipping her fingers into the cool water. "This place always makes me feel calm," she said. He sat beside her. "It reminds me of places I used to go when I was younger. Quiet places where the world feels slower." She looked at him with curiosity. "What were you like when you were younger?" He smiled faintly, less careful. "More certain that the world was simple."
And now? She asked.
"Now I know the world is not simple," he said honestly. "But I also know kindness still exists. I see that more clearly now." Her heart felt warm at his words, though she said nothing. After a while, he stood and picked up a small stone from the ground. He tossed it gently into the water and watched the ripples spread. "Would you like me to show you something?" he asked. "Sure," she said. He crouched near the ground and pointed to faint marks in the dirt near the stream. "These are footprints. Not fresh, but not old either. Someone passed through here earlier today." She looked closely but saw nothing but uneven soil. "How can you tell?" he explained patiently, showing her how the soil was pressed slightly deeper in certain places, how the grass leaned in a certain direction. "The land always speaks," he said. "Most people just don't know how to listen." That's amazing. That's amazing. It's like reading a story written on the ground.
"Yes," he said with a smile.
Every path holds a story. He showed her how to notice broken twigs, bent grass, and small marks others might ignore. She tried to follow his instructions, laughing when she guessed wrong, and smiling when she guessed right. "You're a good teacher," she said. "And you're a good learner," he replied. They spent the rest of the morning walking and talking, sharing stories and thoughts. She told him about her childhood, about helping her parents, about dreaming of faraway places she had only seen in books or heard about from travelers. He listened carefully, never interrupting, never judging. In return, he spoke about the lands he had seen, the mountains, rivers, and forests that stretched beyond the horizon. He did not speak of danger or hardship, but of beauty, resilience, and the quiet lessons the road had taught him. As the sun climbed higher, they returned to the village. The maid noticed that people were no longer watching him with suspicion. Some nodded at him, others greeted him politely. A few even smiled. The change was small, but clear. At the well, a woman dropped her bucket by accident. Before she could bend down, the Apache stepped forward and picked it up for her. "Here," he said gently. "Thank you," she replied, surprised but grateful. The maid watched the exchange and felt proud, though she could not fully explain why. That afternoon they worked together in the village garden, helping an elderly man repair a broken fence. The Apache used his skills to tie the wood securely while the maid fetched tools and held boards in place. They worked smoothly, without needing many words, like two people who had known each other far longer than a few days. When the fence was finished, the old man smiled warmly. "You work well together," he said. "The village is better for it." The maid felt her cheeks warm slightly, but she smiled. "Thank you." The Apache simply nodded, though something in his eyes softened. As evening approached, clouds gathered in the sky and the wind picked up. The air grew cooler and the sky darkened. Soon rain began to fall, first gently, then harder. People hurried indoors, closing shutters and doors. The maid and the Apache were caught between buildings when the rain started. They ran toward her house, laughing softly as the rain soaked their clothes. When they reached shelter, both were breathing fast, hair wet, faces bright with unexpected joy.
"That was sudden," she said, pushing wet hair from her face.
"Yes," he said with a small laugh, "but not unpleasant." Inside she lit a small fire, and they sat near it to warm themselves. The sound of rain on the roof filled the room, steady and soothing. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light on the walls. For a while, neither spoke. They simply listened to the rain and watched the flames. Then the maid said quietly, "Do you ever feel like you don't belong anywhere?" He looked at the fire before answering. "Sometimes. When you move from place to place, it's easy to feel like the world has no home for you." She nodded slowly. "I've never left this village, but sometimes I still feel that way, like I'm waiting for something I can't name." He turned to her. "Maybe belonging is not always a place," he said. "Maybe it's a feeling, or a moment." Her heart skipped slightly at his words, though she did not show it. The rain continued into the night, gentle and steady. They prepared a simple meal together, cutting vegetables, stirring soup, sharing small smiles and quiet laughter. Everything felt natural, easy. After dinner they sat near the window, watching raindrops slide down the glass. The world outside seemed far away, quiet and distant.
"I'm glad you stayed," she said softly.
"So am I," he replied. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but full of meaning. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just kindness, but strength, patience, and warmth. She looked at him and saw not just a traveler, but a thoughtful soul shaped by experience and quiet courage. Neither spoke what they were thinking, but both felt it, something deeper than friendship, something growing slowly and carefully, like a seed beneath the soil. That night, as they prepared to sleep, the rain finally eased. The village lay quiet under a sky full of clouds, and the air smelled clean and fresh. Before she turned away, the maid said, "Tomorrow the hills beyond the fields are beautiful at sunrise." He smiled gently. "Then I would like to see them with you." She returned the smile, feeling a warmth she had never felt before.
As darkness settled, both lay awake longer than usual, thoughts moving quietly through their minds.
Neither knew what the future would bring, but both felt certain of one thing. This meeting, this connection, was not an accident. It was something rare and meaningful, something worth protecting. Outside, the clouds slowly parted, revealing stars once again. And inside, two hearts, once lonely in different ways, felt a little less alone. The morning came quietly, with the sun slowly peeking over the hills. The sky was soft and clear, with light drifting gently across the village. Birds sang their songs, and the wind carried the scent of wet earth from the rain the night before. Everything felt fresh and new, yet calm, as if the world itself was resting for a while before the day began in earnest. The maid woke early, as was her habit, and moved quietly through the small house. She did not want to disturb the Apache traveler, who had been awake before sunrise, sitting by the window and watching the hills bathed in soft light. His face, calm and thoughtful, seemed almost different in the morning. He appeared less burdened by the weight of the world, more at ease. The maid smiled quietly to herself. There was something in his presence that made her mornings feel warmer, simpler, and more hopeful. After a light breakfast, she suggested they take a walk toward the hills again. The weather was perfect, cool, but not cold, with a soft breeze that carried the fragrance of wildflowers and grass. The Apache agreed, and together they left the village, walking along a narrow path that led to the open fields. As they walked, the maid noticed that more villagers were out and about. Some looked at them with curiosity, some with cautious smiles, but none seemed fearful. She realized that the Apache's quiet kindness had already begun to influence those around him. "Do you like it here?" she asked softly as they walked. He paused, looking around at the fields, the hills, and the distant mountains. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is different from anywhere I have been, but I like it. It feels peaceful." The maid smiled, pleased with his answer. "The hills are even more beautiful closer to sunrise," she said. "The light touches everything, and the wind carries a sound you can almost hear in your heart." He looked at her curiously. "In my travels, I've seen many sunrises, but I would like to see this one with you." They walked in silence for a while, enjoying the simple beauty of the land around them. The fields stretched endlessly, dotted with wildflowers and patches of grass that swayed gently in the wind. The hills rose in the distance, their slopes softened by morning light. Every step they took felt natural, like they were following a rhythm that had existed long before either of them had arrived. As they neared the first hill, the maid stopped and pointed to a faint path leading upward. "If we climb here, we can see the village below and the horizon beyond," she said. "It is my favorite place to think." He nodded and followed her up the small incline. The path was uneven, with stones and roots, but they moved carefully, helping each other when needed. At the top they paused, both breathing a little heavily from the climb, and looked out at the view. The village lay below them, peaceful and quiet. Smoke rose gently from a few chimneys, and the fields stretched out toward the hills and mountains in the distance. The sky was turning brighter now, the first hints of gold and pink reflecting on the clouds. The wind blew softly, and the sound of birds filled the air. It was beautiful, and both of them felt it deeply. "This is amazing," the Apache said quietly. "I have never seen a view like this. It makes the world feel both larger and smaller at the same time." "It does, doesn't it? It makes you feel like you can think about everything and nothing at once." They sat together on a large rock, letting the wind brush against their faces. For a long while they did not speak, simply watching the colors of the sky shift as the sun climbed higher. Then the maid asked, "Do you miss home?" He looked down at his hands. "Sometimes," he said. "But home is not always a place. Sometimes it is a feeling, a memory, or even a person. And now I feel a little at home here, with you in this village." She looked at him quietly, feeling her heart warm at his words. "I feel the same," she admitted. "Even though I have lived here all my life, having someone to share it with, it changes everything." For a moment, they sat in silence again, sharing the quiet peace of the morning. Then the Apache noticed movement on a distant path below the hill. 2 villagers were carrying a small load of firewood, and one stumbled slightly. Without thinking, he stepped forward and shouted, "Be careful!" The villagers looked up, startled by his voice, but then they smiled and nodded, reassured by his concern. The maid noticed a small change in their expressions, the way they began to see him not just as a stranger, but as someone who cared for them, even in small ways. After the morning on the hill, they walked back toward the village slowly, stopping at places where the maid wanted to show him small details: a patch of wildflowers, a clear stream, and a tree that had grown in the shape of a heart. Each moment was quiet, simple, and meaningful. The Apache listened carefully, asked questions, and sometimes offered gentle observations. Back in the village, they helped an elderly woman gather herbs from her small garden. The Apache knelt carefully, showing her how to pick them without damaging the plants. The maid watched him, feeling admiration for his thoughtfulness. Even in small tasks, he carried care and respect, and it reminded her of the beauty of human connection. As the afternoon passed, They found themselves near the village square. Children were playing, and the Apache stopped to watch them. One child ran up with a ball and offered it to him. At first, he hesitated, unsure what to do. But then he smiled and caught the ball, gently tossing it back. Laughter filled the air, and the maid laughed too, delighted by the simple joy of the moment. Later, they walked to the edge of the village where the forest began. The maid had always loved this place, with its tall trees, moss-covered stones, and the quiet sound of leaves moving in the wind. She showed him how to identify different trees, how to notice small changes in the forest, and even how to find edible plants. The Apache listened carefully, fascinated by her knowledge. "You are very wise," he said quietly. "I have learned many things from you today." She smiled softly. "And I from you. You see the world in a way I have never thought of. You notice things that most people ignore." As evening approached, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. A strong wind began to blow, rustling the trees and carrying the scent of rain. The maid looked at the sky with concern. "I think a storm is coming," she said. The Apache nodded.
Then we should return quickly. It will be safer in the village.
They hurried back, moving through the wind as it grew stronger. Soon, heavy rain began to fall, drenching them completely. They ran the last stretch together, laughing despite the storm, and finally reached the safety of her home. Water dripped from their hair and clothes, and they were both exhausted, but they could not stop smiling. Inside, they warmed themselves by the fire. The maid dried her hair, and the Apache removed his wet clothes carefully, hanging them to dry. They shared a simple meal, quiet but comforting, the fire casting warm light across their faces. The storm continued outside, but inside there was only peace and warmth. After the meal, they sat by the window, watching the rain fall in sheets across the village. The Apache spoke quietly, his voice thoughtful. "Today was important, not because of anything extraordinary, but because it felt real. I felt seen, and I hope I gave the same to you. You have. More than you know. Today showed me that trust and kindness can grow quickly if we give them the chance." He nodded slowly. "I feel the same. The world is often uncertain and hard, but moments like today remind me why it is worth living and caring." As night fell, the rain softened to a gentle drizzle. The fire crackled softly, and the village lay quiet beneath the stormy sky. The maid and the Apache sat in silence for a long while, thinking about the day, about each other, and about the connection that had grown between them. It was fragile, yes, but real, built on trust, respect, and the shared experience of the day. Before sleeping, the maid spoke quietly, almost to herself. "Tomorrow, the sun will rise again, and the world will continue. But today will stay with me." The Apache looked at her, understanding her completely without needing to speak. "And it will stay with me too," he said softly. That night both lay awake longer than usual, listening to the rain, feeling the warmth of the fire, and knowing that this day had changed something inside them. They had shared a small adventure, learned from each other, and found a connection stronger than either had expected. The world outside remained uncertain, but inside that small house there was trust, hope, and the quiet beginning of something lasting. Outside, the storm slowly passed. The first stars appeared in the sky, twinkling softly, as if celebrating the bond formed below. Inside, two hearts, once separate and cautious, now felt a little closer, united by kindness, understanding, and the simple truth that people can change each other's lives, even in unexpected ways. The morning was quiet, almost tender, with the soft light of dawn spilling over the village rooftops. The air smelled fresh, a mixture of grass, flowers, and the faint scent of smoke from early fires. Birds sang lightly in the trees, their songs gentle and hopeful, as if sensing the significance of the day. The village was just waking, and yet there was a calm that seemed different from the ordinary mornings. Inside the small house, the maid was already awake. Her thoughts were heavy but tender. Today was the day he would leave. The Apache traveler, who had become a quiet presence in her life, would continue his journey. Her heart felt tight at the thought, though she knew it was inevitable. She moved quietly through the room, preparing a simple breakfast, wanting to keep the morning ordinary, even if her feelings were far from it. The Apache was sitting by the window, his gaze distant as he looked at the hills in the early light. He had not spoken much since waking, and the maid knew he was thinking, remembering, perhaps even feeling the same bittersweet mix she carried. When he finally turned and met her eyes, there was a softness there that spoke more than words could. "Good morning," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but the gentleness in it carried a depth of feeling she could not ignore. "Good morning," she replied, her voice trembling slightly, though she tried to hide it. "Breakfast is ready." They ate quietly, the only sounds the clinking of utensils and the soft crackle of the fire. Neither wanted to rush, neither wanted to speak too soon. Every glance, every small movement, seemed full of meaning. After breakfast, the maid led him outside. The village was stirring, but the sun was low enough that shadows still lingered along the streets. She noticed how calm and steady he seemed, yet there was something in his eyes, a mixture of sadness and gratitude. They walked slowly to the edge of the village, to the path where the hills began. The air was cool, and the morning breeze carried a soft, gentle whisper through the trees. They stopped at the first hill, the place where they had first climbed together to see the sunrise. The view was familiar and comforting. The village lay below, the field stretched far into the distance, and the sky was painted with delicate shades of gold and pink. "I will miss this," he said softly, looking out over the land. "I will miss the quiet, the hills, and all of this." He gestured towards her, gently and without words needing to be spoken. "I will miss you too," the maid said, her voice breaking slightly. She swallowed hard, wishing she could find the right words to explain everything she felt. "You have made these days different, better. I will remember them always." He turned to her, eyes gentle and thoughtful. "And I will remember you. This village, your kindness, and the way you showed me that trust and friendship still exist. You have given me something I thought I would never have again." For a long moment, they stood together sharing the silence, letting the breeze carry their unspoken feelings. Neither wanted to move first, neither wanted to break the fragile, beautiful connection they had formed. But the path beyond the village awaited him, and he could not linger forever. Finally, he spoke again.
I must continue my journey.
"But before I go, I want you to know, you have changed me. You have reminded me that even in a world full of uncertainty, there can be moments of peace, of kindness, and of understanding. That is something I will carry with me always." Her eyes filled with tears, though she blinked quickly to keep them from falling. "And you have reminded me," she said softly, "that the world is bigger than we sometimes believe, that there are people who care, even if they are strangers at first. You will always be part of my heart." They hugged briefly, careful and gentle, feeling the warmth of each other's presence one last time. The hug was simple, but it carried everything they had shared: trust, friendship, understanding, and the quiet hope of something lasting beyond this moment. He stepped back, looking at her one last time. "Take care of yourself," he said quietly. "Keep your heart open, and the world will be good to you. Remember me not with sadness, but with the joy of what we shared."
She nodded, trying to smile through the tears. "I will."
"And I will hope that your journey brings you happiness and safety." The Apache turned toward the path that led out of the village, the road stretching ahead into the hills and forests. He walked slowly, almost reluctantly, pausing once to look back. The maid waved gently, her heart heavy but full of warmth. Their eyes met one last time, and in that glance, words were unnecessary. Everything that needed to be said had been said in the days they had spent together, in the small acts of kindness, the shared moments, and the quiet conversations under the stars. As he disappeared into the distance, the maid stood on the hill for a long time, watching until he was a small figure against the horizon. The sun rose higher, casting golden light across the fields, and she felt both sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for the goodbye, but gratitude for the connection they had formed, fragile yet real. She knew that these memories, these feelings, would remain with her forever, a reminder of trust, friendship, and the beauty of human kindness. Back in the village, life continued as usual. Children played, neighbors greeted each other, and the daily routines carried on. Yet for the maid, nothing felt quite the same. Everything she saw, every small sound reminded her of him. The way he laughed, the gentle way he moved, and the kindness he carried with him. She realized that even though he was gone, he had left something behind that would remain with her always, a sense of hope, of connection, and the reminder that people can touch each other's lives in ways that matter. As the day went on, she returned to her chores, tending to the garden and helping her family. She smiled quietly to herself, thinking of the lesson she had learned. She remembered how he had taught her to notice small details, to listen carefully to the world, and to approach life with patience and understanding. She realized that these lessons were gifts, and that they were part of the bond they had shared. In the evening, she walked to the hill once more, the place where they had watched the sunrise together. The sky was painted in warm colors, and the wind carried the scent of wildflowers. She sat quietly, thinking of him, imagining him walking along distant paths, carrying the same thoughts of her in his heart. She felt a sense of peace, knowing that their connection was not lost, that it would continue in memory and in the lessons they had shared. The villagers noticed the change in her as well. She moved with a quiet confidence, a gentle warmth that drew people in. Even those who had once been wary of strangers seemed to sense the shift, the way trust and kindness can ripple through a community. Her family smiled at her, noticing the light in her eyes, though she did not speak of the traveler. Some things are too personal to share, yet they remain important, shaping who we are in quiet ways. That night, the maid sat by the window, looking at the stars. She remembered the nights she had spent talking to him, watching the sky, and listening to the gentle sounds of the village. She felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude, knowing that while their time together had ended, it had been meaningful. It had changed her, opened her heart, and shown her that connection can be found in the most unexpected places. The Apache traveler, far away on his journey, looked at the same stars from a distant hill. He thought of the village, of her, and of the quiet days they had shared. He carried her kindness with him, feeling it strengthen him for the challenges ahead. He remembered the laughter, the conversations, and the small lessons, knowing that they would remain with him always. Days passed, and life continued. The maid returned to her routines, but every small detail reminded her of him. The flowers in the garden, the sound of the wind through the trees, and the gentle movement of the hills all brought memories of their time together. She found joy in these reminders, understanding that though people may leave, the impact they have remains. And so, the story ended not with sadness, but with hope. Two lives had intersected briefly yet meaningfully. They had shared trust, kindness, and understanding, forming a connection that would endure in memory and in the heart. The village continued to thrive. The world remained uncertain, but within that small house and across distant hills, two people had learned the quiet beauty of human connection. The Apache traveled onward, carrying the warmth and lessons of the village with him. The maid continued her life, forever changed by the stranger who had brought new light to her world. And though they were apart, the bond they had formed remained, a reminder that kindness, trust, and understanding can cross distances, cultures, and time, leaving behind something lasting and precious. Even as the sun set and the stars appeared, the memory of those shared days glowed softly in their hearts, a quiet treasure that neither distance nor time could diminish. And in that, both found peace.